Did New Zealand and Australia actually push South Africa out of Super Rugby? Or is that just the version of the story people want to believe? Because depending on who you ask, you'll get two completely different answers. Some fans are convinced South Africa were forced out when the competition reshaped itself without them, while others argue they walked away chasing bigger money and better opportunities in Europe. But when you strip away the emotion and look at actually what happened, the truth is far more complex, and honestly, way more revealing. To understand it, you have to go back to what Super Rugby really was at its core. This wasn't just a competition, it was a partnership between New Zealand, Australia and South Africa, tied together through SANZAR, later SANZAR. For decades, this structure held Southern Hemisphere rugby together and created one of the most exciting competitions in the sport. But here's something a lot of people overlook. South Africa wasn't just another participant in this competition. They were one of the biggest financial drivers behind it. The broadcast deal with SuperSport brought in massive revenue, and with a population far larger than both New Zealand and Australia combined, South Africa viewership played a huge role in the competition's overall value. Advertising, sponsorships, and TV rights were all heavily influenced by South African audiences. In simple terms, Super Rugby didn't just include South Africa, it relied on them. For a long time, that balance worked, but behind the scenes, things weren't as stable as they looked. Travel demands were brutal, with teams flying across multiple time zones and often spending weeks away from home. South African teams in particular faced long tours through Australia and New Zealand, which created a consistent disadvantage in terms of fatigue and performance. At the same time, financial pressures were quietly building, with different currencies, economics, and priorities pulling the competition in different directions. Despite all that, Super Rugby held together until 2020, when COVID hit. It didn't just disrupt rugby, it completely broke the system that Super Rugby depended on. Travel between countries became nearly impossible, and New Zealand and Australia introduced some of the strictest border controls in the world. Almost overnight, the idea of teams flying across the continents every week became unworkable. As a result, the competition split. New Zealand created Super Rugby Aotearoa, Australia launched its own domestic version, and South Africa followed a local format. For the first time in decades, three nations weren't competing together. They were operating separately. And once the separation happened, it exposed deeper problems that had been sitting under the surface for years. Without regular international fixtures, the financial structure of Super Rugby started to unravel. For years, broadcast deals had been negotiated in US dollars, which provided stability and protected all parties from currency fluctuations. But in 2020, that situation changed when South Africa's broadcaster moved towards playing in rand instead. On the surface, that might not sound like a big issue, but in reality, it was significant. Over time, the South African rand had weakened considerably compared to currencies like the New Zealand dollar. When long-term contracts were locked into a weakened currency, the actual value received by other unions can drop dramatically. This wasn't just speculation, it was a real financial risk. Former New Zealand Rugby chairman Brent MP confirmed that accepting a rand-based structure would have the competition financially unsuitable for New Zealand. From New Zealand's perspective, that wasn't about pushing South Africa out. It was about avoiding a deal that could leave them financially exposed for years. But from South Africa's point of view, the situation looked very different. For decades, their broadcasting strength had helped support the competition. So when they moved to protect their own economic position, it was suddenly seen as a deal breaker. Depending on how you look at it, one side was protecting its future, while on the other felt as a long-term contribution being undervalued. This is where the partnership really started to fracture. But the story doesn't end here, because South Africa didn't suddenly decide to leave. In fact, they had already been exploring other options for years. There had been growing interest in aligning with European rugby, and the reasons were clear. Better time zones meant matches could be played at more convenient hours for both players and audiences. Travel demands were reduced compared to constant long flight hauls in the Southern Hemisphere. And financially, European competitions offered more stability and long-term potential. So when South African teams began moving towards competitions like Pro 14, it wasn't a random decision. It was part of a broader strategy. COVID didn't create that, it accelerated that. What had once been a future possibility quickly became the most logical path forward. At the same time, New Zealand and Australia were dealing with their own challenges. Without South Africa, the traditional Super Rugby format no longer worked, so they made a decision to rebuild the competition into a Pacific-based structure, reducing travel and simplifying logistics. That's how Super Rugby Pacific was formed. This is where the debate really heats up. South African teams were not included in this new format. While there were no official statements saying they were kicked out, the reality is that when a competition moves forward without you, the results feel the same. However, by that stage, South Africa were already heading in a different direction. Their shift towards European rugby was well underway, and the new Super Rugby structure simply didn't align with their long-term goals. So rather than one-sided decision, this became a situation where both sides were moving away from each other at the same time. Another key detail that often gets overlooked is how these long-term tensions had been building before the 2020. Even during the peak years of Super Rugby, there were ongoing disagreements around scheduling, travel fatigue, and revenue distribution. South African teams frequently raised concerns about competitive fairness, especially with long travel blocks and time zone disadvantages. At the same time, New Zealand Rugby had growing concerns about maintaining financial stability as the competition expanded and costs increased. So when the pandemic hit, it didn't create problems, it exposed existing ones. It forced all parties to make faster, harder decisions that had probably been coming for years. And in situations like that, unions don't think emotionally, they think strategically. Interestingly, once everything settled, both sides ended up in strong positions. South African teams joined the United Rugby Championship, competing against European clubs and gaining access to competitions like the Champions Cup. This move aligned better with their time zones, reduced travel strain, and opened up new financial opportunities. Meanwhile, New Zealand and Australia reshaped Super Rugby into more of a regional competition. By focusing on teams with closer proximities, they reduced costs and created a more sustainable structure moving forward. While the product looks different today, it is arguably more stable than it was in its final years before the split. So despite all the tension, all the debate, and all the accusations, this wasn't a collapse, it was a reset. Just one that didn't happen in a way everyone agreed on. And that's why this topic still sparks so much discussion. It ultimately comes down to perspective. If you focus on South Africa not being included in the Super Rugby format, it looks like they were pushed out. If you look at the long-term strategy and eventual move to Europe, it looks like they chose to leave. But when you step back and look at the full picture, it becomes clear this wasn't just one side making a single decision. It was a combination of factors all happening at once. COVID restrictions made travel impossible, financial disagreements created tension, and strategic goals started pulling the unions in different directions. All of that built up until the partnership simply couldn't continue the way it had been before. So no, South Africa weren't officially pushed out, but they also didn't just walk away without pressure. The reality sits somewhere in the middle. And in the end of the day, Super Rugby didn't lose South Africa in one dramatic moment. It slowly moved away from them. The real question now, did Super Rugby lose something it can't replace? Or did both sides end up exactly where they needed to be? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe for the next video just like this. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time. Peace!